Can you please briefly talk about the circumstances that led to the formation of ACORD? Just a brief history.
Well, ACORD comes from a history of being a consortium of northern NGOs. It was primarily created out of the drought in the Sahel in the 70s, where northern organizations had a very good response in terms of people donating for wanting something done about the drought. Now, having collected all the money, they realized that they didn't have any operations in Africa because the drought was mainly in areas that were very remote and had to reach. And setting up infrastructure and everything else would have been particularly difficult. So they came together and created ACORD. ACORD's original name was Euro Action Accord. And the idea was to then have an operational arm in Africa that implemented on behalf of the consortium members. That's the history. Our perspective is global, but our focus is Africa. So what we do is through our networks and alliances, work globally. But in terms of concrete activities, our focus is Africa. And we take the information we have and share it globally and bring back what we are learning through our global relationships to inform our work in Africa in terms of how the continent relates to the external world. So in that sense, ACORD is global in its perspective and works in that way through networks, through alliances, through connections it has, but concretely focused in Africa. If you look at our governance structure, it's very international. It draws from every part of the world. Our assembly draws from every part of the world. But they all come together to talk about Africa and the work we do in Africa and how does that relate with the global world. Several things in publishing the book. One is to document the history of ACORD. The other one is to share learning in the 35-year history of ACORD. And there's a lot of discussion in the sector about issues like decentralization, southern empowerment, giving people a voice, to be working primarily in Africa with initially a mix of African and expatriate staff, slowly seeing a reduction of the expatriate staff and becoming primarily staffed by Africans. And in that process, a consciousness was developed by the African staff that if this is about Africa and serving the African continent, then we need to play a bigger role. We need to take responsibility and demonstrate that we are citizens of this continent and committed to its needs. Therefore, claim making started to happen around ownership of the organization, because it was at that point primarily northern membership in the assembly and the governing structures up until probably early 90s. That's when you started having Africans in the governance. By then, ACORD had worked in the continent for well over 15 years. And there was enough African staff who were sufficiently skilled, had the necessary capacities, and had a better understanding of the continent, given the areas in which they were working and the sort of work they were doing, and started making claims for ownership of the organization, but more importantly, for greater participation in the decision-making processes of the organization. Now, other organizations come at it by decentralizing, creating local chapters, creating local boards. But in ACORD, it was a much more natural process that was internal, that was driven by people's energies, people's wishes. And the governing structures responded to that and allowed a process of change for greater Africanization, greater African ownership, but still ensuring that it maintained its historical links with the North and other alliances that it had built. The third is to actually inform thinking around, okay, having had all this experience, what does it mean looking forward? The book stops at 2010, and we're now in 2012. So it's also meant for those who are involved in ACORD and those who will come to ACORD later to start reflecting about, okay, what does this mean? In 35 years, this is the trajectory that it has taken. Given the current global dynamics, given the environment we operate in, given the greater consciousness that is emerging from the African continent, what does it mean? So it's these three things really that have encouraged us to document the history. And you will also see that it's also a recognition of those who have been involved in those 35 years, because people have played different roles at different times, all of which have been very valuable. So that is also useful for them to be able to reflect, looking back at some of the things that they have contributed.
Okay. What is ACORD's mission? What do you guys do?
Well, ACORD's core mission is to work on social justice. And if you look at the literature we now use, we talk about defending rights and promoting justice. We don't come at it through poverty alleviation. That's not our language. Our language is about rights and justice, which is about people, which is about empowerment. Empowering people to be able to exercise their rights. Our view is that that is much more long-lasting, that is much more sustainable. Now that by no means suggests that we would not respond to immediate needs in circumstances where that is required. But we will do so with a view to making sure that we work in such a way that it is unlikely to happen again. Therefore, we talk about looking at the root causes of issues and trying to address them, rather than stopping at addressing consequences only. And that's what I think makes us stand apart from other organizations in the way we come at doing our work. So it's about recognizing people and valuing people. And then through that, giving them the courage, the confidence, to actually feel they can change their own circumstances. They can influence what is making life difficult for them. And that's a very, very, very different way of looking at it. I think the key was there was openness, and there were honest conversations that had to take place to address the power relationships. Because the claim of ownership, at the time, we were able to separate issues of money and issues of relevance. And the focus was much more what is relevant for the African continent. And that meant people were allowed to contribute their ideas, people were allowed to share their ideas, and there was no fear about doing that. Because a basis was set where people could openly talk about what they thought was making it difficult for the organization to respond effectively to the requirements of the African continent. And that certainly took a long time and was very, very difficult. There were very painful moments in doing that. But I think the fundamental reason why it worked was that there was openness and there was honesty in the conversations. And we avoided, in as far as we could, telling people what needed to be done. We allowed processes to be self-driven and solutions to emerge from within. And that wasn't perfect, but it certainly gave us a stronger basis for doing it right. Quite a number of milestones in terms of, if you go to where ACORD started, which is in the Sahel, if you go to northern Mali, some of the most effective civil society organizations working in Mali were partners of ACORD, who have worked with ACORD over many years, and ACORD phased out and allowed them to continue working. In the Eastern Africa, there's an organization called OMIPA that works on microfinance, and is probably one of the biggest microfinance networks in East Africa at the moment, who was a partner of ACORD. And ACORD phased out and allowed its own staff to recreate a national entity and continue the process. Those are two examples in terms of our project work. In terms of the staff who've gone through ACORD, many of them have ended up either in central government in their own countries or in very, very significant international organizations occupying key roles, having really gone through the organization. And that's how we see ourselves. We see ourselves as strengthening and building capacity for people to then make a choice around how they see it best to influence or to have an impact. We spend quite a lot of time thinking about who would be best placed to author such a book. And we also needed to ensure that in doing it, we chose a theme around which the book could be written. Because there were many things going on: programmatic, organizational development, many other issues. And we chose to focus on the issue of identity and came at it with an organizational development lens. And Alan happens to have a lot of expertise in this area, having authored earlier books in the same area, but also having been involved with civil society for over 30 years, particularly in the South, working quite closely with organizations who are not too dissimilar to ACORD. And we therefore thought that he would be well positioned to do that. We are planning a launch after the Kenya launch, we're planning a launch in the UK, a launch in Canada, and a launch in France. And neither of those are accidental. The history of ACORD comes from there. Those were the key organizations. It was CCFD, Oxfam GB, and at the time, a Canadian development worker who was very keen on Africa, who came together to create ACORD. And if you read the book, there's a napkin that seeks to demonstrate all the money they had and how they thought they could put it together to create ACORD. So we also wanted to ensure, and many of them are living and still in contact with ACORD. So we wanted to ensure that we also recognize that in launching the book, because a significant part of the book talks about them and the areas in which they worked. And most of them have moved on. But there are people who have come on board who still continue to relate with ACORD, who may not have that history. And therefore, launching the book in such a context could allow us also reconnect with all of them and share with them a history to which they have contributed significantly. That's why we've made those three choices.
Where can people in Kenya now be able to purchase the book?
Well, you can go to our website. That's one option. It's available online, and you can also come to the office. And I'm sure progressively the people in marketing in our office will create much more avenues for doing that. And if that is done, it will still be on the website. So the website is a good place to go. And I know that they run a Facebook page, they're on Twitter. So they have connectivity in terms of modern channels for communication.
In the future, other than this book, what other plans do you guys have for ACORD? Any future announcements or events, launches that you may have?
One of the key issues that we want to focus on really, it's around communication and making sure that we develop a collective African voice. But much more fundamentally is to also try and tap into our own resources to do our work and really work towards the African continent funding in as much as possible its own development work. And we see ourselves as adequately placed to do that, to try and generate resources from within and ensure that supports our work. And that means relating with the external world as well and creating partnerships that actually support that, partnerships that understand that perspective. It's not a 1, 2, 3 year affair, it's a long-term affair. But one of the things that we pride ourselves in ACORD is about thinking outside the box to really try and have a long-term perspective about what this continent is likely to look like in 10, 15 years' time, and ensure that we resource the organization in such a way that it can respond to that to ensure continued relevance, which is not an easy thing, but it's something that we try and do. So valuing our people, supporting them, and making sure that they're sufficiently motivated to engage in those processes is something that is an ongoing process in the organization.